April 1944. Buchenwald Concentration Camp, Germany. The air was thick with smoke, the metallic stench of fear and the distant cries of prisoners echoing through the barbed wire labyrinth. Lieutenant Joseph Moser, barely alive, pressed his trembling hands against the worn strap of his wristwatch, the last connection to a life that felt like a different world. Around him, emaciated men shuffled, their hollow eyes reflecting despair that words could never capture. S.M.T.'s guards patrolled, boots striking stone with cruel precision, their shadows swallowing any hope. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, weakness at his limbs, and every moment felt like a countdown to oblivion. Then, in a decision that defied both reason and humanity, Moser offered the only thing he had left, his watch, for a crust of bread. A simple exchange, yet one that carried the weight of life and death. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to where it all began. It was the spring of 1944, and the shadows of war had spread across Europe like a dark tide. Germany, once a nation of industry and culture, had become a machine of oppression, its cities scarred by bombings and its people living under the rigid rule of the Nazi regime. Buchenwald, perched on a hill just outside Weimar, was one of the largest concentration camps in the Reich. Barbed wire fences stretched endlessly, punctuated by watchtowers where SS guards scanned the grounds with ruthless eyes. The barracks were overcrowded, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, smoke from burning refuse, and the unmistakable stench of fear. Life in the camp moved in cruel rhythms: roll calls at dawn, forced labor in the mud and cold, and punishments meted out without warning. Every day was a battle to survive, every night a test of endurance. And yet, amid this orchestrated nightmare, life stubbornly persisted. Prisoners whispered, shared scraps of food, and clung to memories of freedom as if they were lifelines to another world. Europe in 1944 was teetering on the brink. The Allies were advancing from the west after the D-Day landings in Normandy, while the Soviet Red Army pressed from the east, squeezing Nazi Germany from both sides. Inside Buchenwald, the world outside seemed almost unreal, yet its pressure was felt in every punishment, every hurried march to the work details, and every fleeting rumor of liberation. For those who found themselves in the camp, normal rules no longer applied. Even soldiers captured in uniform, men who should have been protected by international conventions, were stripped of their rights if they fell into the hands of the Gestapo. Lieutenant Joseph Moser, a young pilot in his mid-20s, had experienced this brutal reality firsthand. Shot down over occupied France, captured and interrogated, he was considered not just a prisoner of war, but a terror flieger in the eyes of the Nazis, a label that carried the risk of immediate execution. Survival demanded more than courage. It demanded cunning, patience, and a willingness to trade pieces of one's own dignity for the barest necessities. Moser arrived at Buchenwald in the spring of 1944, transported alongside a small group of Allied airmen who had been deemed problem prisoners by the Gestapo. Unlike the common POW camps, where Geneva Convention protections applied, Buchenwald offered no such guarantees. The camp was a place of terror, and the arrival of these soldiers was met with suspicion and hostility. On his first night, Moser witnessed the camp's unrelenting cruelty firsthand. Men beaten for speaking out of turn, prisoners collapsing from exhaustion, and the ever-present threat of random execution. It was here, in the darkness of the barracks and the shadows of the watchtowers, that he made a decision that would define his will to live, to barter his wristwatch, the last tangible connection to a life before the war, for a single crust of bread. It was a small act, almost invisible in the scale of suffering around him, yet it represented the essence of survival in a place designed to strip humanity away. From that moment, every choice, every exchange, and every calculated risk became a matter of life or death. And that's where our story truly begins. Joseph Moser had grown up in a small Midwestern town in the United States, the son of a schoolteacher and a factory worker. From a young age, he had been taught the value of discipline, honesty, and perseverance. The wide-open fields of his hometown offered a sense of freedom that would soon feel impossibly distant. By 1942, as the war in Europe intensified, Moser had enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces, drawn by a sense of duty and the thrill of flight. He trained rigorously, mastering the complex mechanics of the aircraft he would soon command. For him, flying was both an art and a responsibility, a way to protect those who could not protect themselves. He rose quickly through the ranks, demonstrating skill, courage, and a sharp mind, earning the respect of his fellow pilots. Yet, he could never have anticipated that the greatest trial of his life would not come in the skies, but on the ground, behind barbed wire in a place designed to crush the human spirit. In the spring of 1944, Moser's plane was shot down over occupied France. The parachute that saved his life dropped him into enemy territory, where the Gestapo captured him within hours. He was transported to Buchenwald alongside a small contingent of Allied airmen, men who had been labeled terror fliegers, considered criminals rather than prisoners of war. The camp was a living nightmare. Prisoners were starved, beaten, and forced into back-breaking labor from dawn until nightfall. Disease spread like wildfire, and the air reeked of smoke, excrement, and death. Moser quickly realized that survival required more than courage, it required strategy. He observed the guards, learning their routines and moods, noticing the tiny cracks in the rigid system of control. Hunger gnawed at him relentlessly, sapping his strength, and yet he forced himself to remain alert. Every whispered conversation, every shared morsel of food, every stolen glance at a watch or clock became a measure of time, life, and hope. Moser's early days in the camp were filled with humiliation and fear. He watched men collapse from exhaustion, corpses piled unceremoniously in the corners, the living haunted by the constant specter of death. Yet, amidst this darkness, small acts of resistance and solidarity emerged. Prisoners would quietly share a scrap of bread, cover for one another during inspections, or convey messages between barracks. Moser found himself drawn into this fragile network, realizing that cooperation and trust could mean the difference between life and death. But trust was a dangerous commodity in a place where betrayal could cost a man everything. One particularly harrowing incident occurred during a work detail when an SS guard selected men at random for punishment. A friend beside him was beaten to the brink of unconsciousness simply for stepping out of line. That night, as Moser nursed his own bruises and hunger, he understood the brutal calculus of survival. Sometimes one had to sacrifice pride, possessions, and even pieces of one's humanity to endure. It was in the days following that Moser faced a choice that would define the remainder of his imprisonment. His wristwatch, given to him by his father before deployment, was the last tangible piece of his life before the war, a symbol of time, normalcy, and home. The camp's black market, fueled by bartering among prisoners and occasional complicity of guards, offered an opportunity, a crust of bread in exchange for the watch. For many, this might have seemed a simple transaction, but for Moser, it represented a profound decision. Trading the watch meant severing the last link to his past identity, yet keeping it risked starvation. After long hours of contemplation, he made the choice. He handed over the watch, feeling a mixture of despair and relief, and received a small piece of bread in return. It was barely enough to sustain him physically, but the act rekindled a spark of agency. a reminder that even in a place designed to strip men of all control, decisions could still be made. This act of bartering became a small but crucial turning point. Moser began to navigate the camp with a sharper awareness of his environment. He observed the guards' routines, identified sympathetic prisoners and allies, and developed a cautious network to share food, information, and moral support. Each day was still a test, yet he was learning to survive not just through endurance, but through intelligence, observation, and strategic action. He became known among the other Allied airmen as someone who could think clearly under pressure, someone capable of small acts of cunning that preserved life in the midst of chaos. As the months wore on, Moser endured forced labor, extreme hunger, and psychological torment. But each challenge reinforced his determination. He witnessed atrocities that would scar him forever: public executions, the brutal treatment of Jewish prisoners, and the despair etched on the faces of men who had once been vibrant and hopeful. Yet, in these moments, he also saw resilience, courage, and the human instinct to survive. By understanding the rhythms of cruelty, learning when to act, when to hide, and when to barter, Moser carved out a fragile foothold of survival in a camp meant to erase individuality. The turning point had passed, but the struggle was far from over. Each day brought new tests, and with each test, Moser grew more adept at surviving the unimaginable. By the summer of 1944, Buchenwald had become a living nightmare in its most vivid form. The sun beat down mercilessly on the barracks, reflecting off the barbed wire and the stone walls, but it offered no warmth, no reprieve. The prisoners moved like ghosts through the camp, gaunt, hollow-eyed, voices hoarse from shouting and exhaustion. Lieutenant Joseph Moser, now more attuned to the rhythms of the camp than ever before, could sense the invisible currents of danger. Every step, every glance over his shoulder, every heartbeat was measured against the possibility of death. The SS had escalated their punishments, seemingly at random. Men were dragged from the barracks and beaten in the courtyard, sometimes to the point of collapse. The sick and weak were left for days without care, their cries piercing the night like the howl of wolves. The air itself seemed alive with menace. The metallic scent of blood mingled with the acrid smoke from the crematorium chimneys, and the cries of despair echoed endlessly between the walls. Moser had seen friends vanish overnight, only to discover their bodies crumpled and forgotten. Fear was not a fleeting sensation. It was a constant, suffocating presence. One day, Moser was ordered to the work detail at the stone quarry, a place where exhaustion and death walked hand in hand. The sun reflected off the jagged rocks, turning the landscape into a cruel, glittering prison. Each swing of the pickaxe sent shards of stone and sweat flying. The guards paced the edge of the quarry, barking orders in guttural tones, striking with whips or rifle butts for the slightest misstep. Moser's hands bled, his muscles screamed, but he forced himself forward, mindful that any hesitation could be fatal. Around him, men collapsed from sheer exhaustion, only to be pulled up and beaten back into labor. The ground was littered with broken tools, dust, and the bodies of those too weak to continue. It was during these grueling days that Moser witnessed one of the most harrowing events of the camp: a public execution intended as a lesson to all prisoners. A man accused of stealing a few scraps of bread was forced to kneel in the courtyard. The SS officers circled him like predators, their boots stomping with precision, their rifles gleaming in the sun. Moser could hear the man's ragged breaths, smell the sweat and fear, and feel the tremor of anticipation that ran through the assembled prisoners. When the shots rang out, the sound split the air, leaving a ringing in Moser's ears. The courtyard fell silent, except for the ragged sobs of those forced to watch. That day, the stakes of survival became painfully clear. Every action, every small choice, could be a matter of life or death. Hunger remained a relentless companion. The small ration of bread Moser had acquired by trading his watch was almost gone, and yet, even as his stomach ached and weakness threatened to consume him, he had to maintain vigilance. The camp's black market operated in secrecy, an ever-shifting network of bartering and hidden exchanges, but discovery by the guards meant immediate punishment. Moser moved cautiously, exchanging whispers, glances, and small tokens for food, understanding that any misstep could trigger his own execution. One day, during a clandestine transaction for a piece of bread, a guard approached unexpectedly. Moser froze, heart hammering, every nerve on edge. The guard's eyes swept over him, searching, probing. Time seemed to stretch infinitely. A misstep, a twitch, and it could be over. But the guard, distracted by another prisoner, moved on. Moser exhaled, a shuddering, silent relief, knowing that he had narrowly escaped death. As the months dragged on, the camp grew ever more oppressive. Disease spread unchecked, typhus and dysentery claiming prisoners faster than the guards could note. Every day, Moser confronted the fragility of life. He watched men he had come to rely on, friends, allies, succumb to illness, their bodies wasting away until nothing remained. The psychological toll was immense. Despair whispered from every corner, threatening to crush even the strongest wills. Moser, however, drew strength from small acts of defiance. A shared morsel of bread, a whispered joke, the clandestine passing of a message. These tiny sparks of humanity reminded him why survival mattered, not just for himself, but for those who could not endure alone. The point of no return came unexpectedly. A sudden SS inspection swept through the barracks, demanding men line up for head counts. Those who were weak or missing were beaten without mercy. Moser, now familiar with the rhythms of the camp, anticipated the guards' movements, positioning himself strategically near allies and supportive prisoners. The line stretched, tension thick enough to choke on. An emaciated man collapsed midway, and the SS officer's whip cracked across his back. The sound ricocheted in Moser's skull, each strike a hammer pounding at the edges of his resolve. He realized in that instant that survival required total immersion in the camp's logic, a complete surrender to awareness, strategy, and timing. Night offered little respite. The barracks reeked of sweat and fear, the thin straw bedding providing no comfort. Guards made their rounds unpredictably, sometimes stopping to strike prisoners, sometimes simply to assert dominance. Moser lay awake, listening to the soft, anguished murmurs of men around him, imagining his family thousands of miles away, and feeling the crushing weight of isolation. Every sound, the rustle of straw, the whisper of a breath, the distant clatter of boots, was a potential threat. Yet, in this darkness, he plotted, calculated, and observed, recognizing that survival depended on turning knowledge into action. In the following weeks, Moser faced a series of near-fatal situations: forced labor details in pouring rain, exposure to extreme cold at night, and encounters with guards prone to unpredictable violence. In one harrowing episode, a fellow airman collapsed during a work march. The guards threatened execution for anyone who slowed the line. Moser had to act decisively, helping his comrade, hiding evidence of his intervention, and maintaining the appearance of obedience. Each small action carried unimaginable risk. By the autumn of 1944, Moser had become adept at navigating the deadly currents of Buchenwald. He had learned when to speak, when to remain silent, when to barter, and when to observe. His wristwatch was gone, traded for bread, but in its place, He had gained an acute sense of timing, intuition, and strategy, the tools that allowed him to endure. Every decision, every heartbeat, had become a test. In this crucible of fear, Moser's humanity and cunning merged into a singular focus: survive. The camp sought to strip men of identity, but in his determination, Moser refused to be erased. The final days of his ordeal before liberation were a tense blur. Rumors of approaching Allied forces swirled. SS patrols became increasingly erratic and violent, and the hunger and disease had pushed many prisoners to the brink of collapse. Moser, though emaciated and bruised, remained vigilant. He moved with careful precision, helping allies when possible, evading danger when necessary. Each moment was a balance on the razor's edge. Every sound could signal death. Every shadow could conceal it. And yet, amid the terror, he survived. When the dust settled and the gates of Buchenwald finally opened, Lieutenant Joseph Moser emerged alive. A man scarred physically and emotionally, but unbroken in spirit. When the gates of Buchenwald finally opened in April 1945, the scene was almost unimaginable. The remaining prisoners stumbled into the fresh air, blinking against the sun that had once seemed unbearably bright from behind the barbed wire. Lieutenant Joseph Moser, weakened, emaciated, and coated in filth from months of forced labor, took tentative steps forward, each movement a testament to his will to survive. The silence of the camp, previously punctuated by the cries of the suffering, was replaced by the distant sounds of liberation, shouts of Allied soldiers, the clatter of vehicles, the first taste of freedom after years of oppression. For Moser and his fellow prisoners, liberation was overwhelming. Relief battled disbelief. Joy collided with grief. Friends, neighbors, and allies he had leaned on during the darkest days were gone, leaving only echoes of memories and the haunting knowledge of who had survived and who had not. Though Moser had escaped the immediate clutches of death, the psychological toll was staggering. The years of starvation, brutality, and constant fear left scars that no physical healing could erase. He would later recall nights spent awake, replaying the atrocities he had witnessed: the sudden execution of a man for a stolen scrap of bread, the hollowed eyes of prisoners reduced to shadows of their former selves, the SS guards' relentless cruelty. Survivors often found themselves carrying a heavy, invisible burden: survivor's guilt. Moser grappled with the haunting question of why he had survived while so many others had perished. His body had endured the unimaginable, but his mind and spirit were marked by trauma that would take years, even decades, to reconcile. Simple tasks, eating, sleeping, interacting with others, were shadowed by memories of the camp. Nightmares were frequent, often vivid enough to evoke the sensation of hunger and fear all over again. And yet, amidst this psychological chaos, Moser discovered an inner resilience, a determination not merely to live, but to honor the memory of those who had fallen. Lieutenant Joseph Moser's survival was not simply a personal triumph. It became part of the broader historical narrative of courage, endurance, and the human spirit in the face of unimaginable horror. His story, recounted in interviews and memoirs, offered a window into the lived experience of Allied prisoners at Buchenwald, a chapter often overshadowed by the larger narrative of the Holocaust and the European theater of war. By speaking out about the small acts of resistance, the careful bartering, and the keen observation that allowed him and others to survive, Moser helped historians and audiences alike understand the complexity of survival in a concentration camp. His life after the war was dedicated to remembrance, sharing testimony with younger generations, participating in veterans' associations, and preserving the stories of those who had not survived. Though his wristwatch, the emblem of his pre-war identity, had long been gone. The lessons it symbolized endured. Every choice he had made in the camp, every exchange, every calculation between risk and reward became a testament to the resilience of human ingenuity under duress. Moser's legacy lies not only in having survived Buchenwald, but in transforming his experience into a lesson for posterity, that even in the darkest moments, humanity can endure through courage, careful thought, and the bonds formed between those who refuse to be erased. In remembering Lieutenant Joseph Moser, the world is reminded that survival is never merely about the body. It is about preserving dignity, hope, and the essence of what makes us human. Years after the war, Lieutenant Joseph Moser would stand before young faces in classrooms and auditoriums, his voice steady but his eyes distant. He would hold up an old photograph, himself in uniform before the camp, before the hunger, and say softly, "This man had no idea what he was about to endure." Then he would tell them about the day he traded his watch for bread, not as a tale of desperation, but as a symbol of survival. The moment he chose life, even when the world around him had chosen death. For Moser, the war never truly ended. It lived on in the ticking of unseen clocks, in the weight of silence between words, in the faces of those he could never forget. But through his memories, he ensured that their suffering would not vanish into the dust of history. In the end, his story was not about a watch or even a camp. It was about the endurance of hope, fragile, flickering, yet impossible to extinguish. As Moser once said, "They took everything from us, but they could never take the will to survive." Next, we'll uncover another story of defiance, one born not from the battlefield, but from the quiet courage of those who refused to surrender their humanity.